The Nemo Tensor and the Thermarest NeoAir Xlite are two of the most popular backpacking sleeping pads on the market. But which one should you choose? In this video, I'm going to talk through the pros and cons of each one, and I'm going to play favorites and tell you which one I am now using most of the time and why. Before we get into this video, please take a moment to subscribe to my channel for more hiking, backpacking, through hiking, and outdoor content. I'll be through hiking the Colorado Trail later this summer, so if you're interested in the Colorado Trail, definitely make sure you subscribe. Okay, so let's get into the pros and cons of each one. By the way, I have the women's Xlite and I have the Tensor regular insulated. So there are some different sizes and styles for each of these pads, and I'll talk through those, but just know that those are the ones that I'm using in this video. Let's first talk about weight, because that is a biggie when you are backpacking. Often people are trying to cut as much weight as possible so that when you're climbing up and over mountains all day, you're bogging yourself down less. So the NeoAir XLite is definitely the winner in terms of weight, although they're both fairly lightweight sleeping pads. So the XLite, women's and regular, both weigh 12.5 ounces. The Tensor regular, on the other hand, weighs about 15 ounces. So the Xlite also comes in a small, as well as a large and an extra large. So the small obviously weighs a little bit less at about 8 ounces. The large and extra large weigh a little bit more at over a pound. The Tensor weighs about 15 ounces, and the Tensor comes in insulated and non-insulated, and it comes in regular and mummy in a variety of sizes. So the mummy obviously is a little bit lighter than the regular, although not much. If you're looking at the regular size for mummy versus like the normal rectangle pad, there's only like a ½ ounce difference. But if you're looking at insulated versus non-insulated, obviously the non-insulated is a little bit lighter. Let's talk about size. Okay, so they both pack down to about the same size. Pretty small, especially compared to my old Thermarest that I took along the Appalachian Trail, which took up probably double the space of these. I would compare the size to about the same size as a regular Nalgene water bottle. If we're looking at the size of the pads when they're blown up, the Xlite women's is 66 inches by 20 inches, whereas the Nemo Tensor is 76 inches by 25 inches. The Xlite is 2.5 inches thick, and the Tensor is 3 inches thick. I personally prefer the length of the women's Xlite because I find that I'm a short person. I'm only 5'3", and so the Nemo Tensor is a little bit long for me, and it takes up a lot more space in my tent that I feel that I could be using to put my different belongings. Like, I like to put my backpack at my feet, and I really can't do that now with the Nemo Tensor because I now only have a few inches above my head and below my feet in my tent, versus when I'm using the Xlite, I feel like I have a foot below my feet and above my head. So that's a lot of space lost in my tent. As you can see, obviously the Tensor is longer and wider. Thickness, however, does not necessarily equal warmth. So when you're looking at the warmth of a sleeping pad, you want to look at the R value. The higher the R value, the warmer you're going to sleep. So the Xlite women's is 5.4 R value. That is way higher than most of the backpacking sleeping pads you're gonna see on the market. The regular non-women's version has an R value of 4.2. The Nemo Tensor, on the other hand, even though it's thicker, it only has an R value of 3.5. So when we're talking about warmth to weight ratio, the Xlite is definitely the winner. So I'm a pretty cold sleeper, so R value is pretty important to me. And I would definitely say for me that I do notice a difference when I'm sleeping on the Xlite versus the Tensor. I definitely notice that I sleep a little bit warmer with the Xlite. So if I'm ever going on a trip where I really expect it to be cold out, I'm probably gonna take the Xlite along. Next, let's talk about cost. In terms of cost, the Xlite women's runs about $200 on the Thermarest website. The Xlite regular runs about $230 on the Thermarest website. The Nemo Tensor regular, on the other hand, runs for about $160 on the Nemo website. So if we're looking at cost, the the Tensor is the winner. And by the way, unless you're only gonna be camping in the summer, not at high elevation, not in the mountains, I would definitely go with the insulated version if you're gonna get the Nemo Tensor, because your sleeping pad makes a huge difference in how warm you're going to sleep. Moving on, let's talk about blowing these babies up. The Xlite has a two-way valve, so that means when I'm blowing it up, if I take my mouth off the valve, the air is gonna come right back out. So I actually have to twist this in order to lock the air inside. The Tensor, on the other hand, has a one-way valve, so I can blow air into this, and it's gonna stay in there. So the way I get the air out of this is that I just pull this extra valve off and then squeeze the air out. For extra protection so the air doesn't come out while I'm sleeping, there's also a cap that you can put on top of that one-way valve. Okay, let's talk about how many breaths it takes to blow these two up. I'm gonna blow these two up right now and I'm gonna count them and I'm gonna tell you how many breaths it took me to blow them up. Okay, here's the Xlite. Let's go. Let's see how many breaths. Okay, so the Xlite took me 38 breaths to blow it up. The Tensor took me 44 breaths. Am I dizzy? A little bit. The Tensor actually comes with a pump stack, so you'd actually connect this to the valve on your sleeping pad, and then you can blow into the sack, and then use that air to push it into the sleeping pad. And another benefit of that is I've heard that if you're blowing into your sleeping bag, that's obviously hot, moist air, so it can cause molding on the inside of your sleeping pad. I've personally never noticed that happening with any of my sleeping pads, but I've heard that it can happen. So it kind of gives you a separation between your pad and your breath. But I don't like using this. I think that it's slower and more tedious and more time consuming than just blowing directly into the pad. So obviously it took me less breaths to blow up the Xlite than it did the Tensor, which makes sense because the Xlite is smaller. However, I would have expected there to be a greater difference, but I would attribute that to the difference in the valves. Since the Xlite has a two-way valve, I feel like I'm fighting like air is coming out as I'm getting a breath, whereas with the Tensor, the air is just staying put. Even when I take a breath, no air is coming out. In terms of durability, I haven't used either of these pads on a long trail yet, but they've both held up pretty well for weekend-long backpacking trips and week-long backpacking trips. However, I have heard from other hikers that they find the Thermarest to be pretty durable and to last a really long time, like a full through hike without ever having to patch it up. Whereas I am a little nervous about taking the Tensor on a long trip because I've heard that it does get holes in it easily and requires patching up like fairly often. So for example, my friend Stephanie is on the Pacific Crest Trail this year, and I recently saw an Instagram post from her that said she's already had to repair and patch her Tensor 4 times, and she's only been out on the PCT at this point for a couple of months. So that's definitely a consideration, and it's something I worry about with taking the Tensor on a long trip. And finally, let's talk about comfort. Obviously, everyone's body is different, and this is very subjective, but I find the Tensor to be much, much, much more comfortable than the Xlite. When I use the Xlite, I'm tossing and turning all night long. My hips are falling asleep. I'm rolling off the pad. It's just, I just don't find that pad to be particularly comfortable, which is fine for just a weekend. But if I'm going on a longer trip, that's a huge concern because obviously if you're not getting sleep, that's affecting your mental state, and you gotta keep your mental state in tip-top shape when you're out on the trail. The Tensor, on the other hand, I find to be pretty darn comfortable. I actually was on a trip to Moab last spring, and my friend Kelsey had the Tensor, and I ended up trying that pad, just laying on it for a minute, and I was like, wow, this is so much more comfortable than my pad. I noticed it just within like a few seconds of laying on the pad. I was like, this is a huge difference, and I find the Tensor to be just like way more comfortable than the Xlite. One other thing that I'll mention is that if you are not a sound sleeper, if noises bother you or bother the people that you're camping with, then you may want to stay away from the Xlite, because I find the Xlite to be a pretty loud pad. It makes a lot of noise when you're moving around on it, whereas the Tensor is a little bit quieter. It's definitely not as noticeable for me. I mean, don't get me wrong, it still makes noise when you roll around on it, but it definitely seems to be a lot quieter than the Xlite. But to help you make your decision on which pad that you should get, let's review the factors and talk about which pad was the winner in all of the different categories. In terms of weight, the Xlite is lighter, so it's definitely the winner. In terms of cost, the Tensor is cheaper, so it's the winner. In terms of the R value, the Xlite is the clear winner. Definitely the warmer pad. In terms of pad size, it depends on what you're looking for. Do you want a bigger pad that you're probably gonna stay on a little better in your sleep, or do you want it to take up less space in your tent? If you're looking for a bigger pad, the Tensor is the winner. If you're looking for your pad to take up less space in your tent, then the Xlite is the winner. In terms of noise, the Tensor is quieter, so it's the clear winner. In terms of blowing up the pads, the Xlite is smaller, so it doesn't take as many breaths, but the Tensor has a one-way valve, so air you're blowing in doesn't come straight back out. So I find that a little less discouraging than when I'm blowing up the Xlite and air that I'm blowing in comes right back out. So in terms of the winner on that one, I'll let you decide. In terms of durability, I have heard that the Xlite lasts a lot longer than the Tensor, so the Xlite is the winner. And finally, in terms of comfort, as I said, this is subjective, but I find the Tensor to be the clear winner in terms of comfort. So which pad should you take out backpacking or on a thru hike? Well, obviously it's totally up to you and you need to look at the pros and cons of each one, but I personally am taking the Tensor on all of my backpacking trips right now. I'm gonna give it a try on the Colorado Trail later this summer to see if it holds up and if it is durable enough to take on an even longer thru hike. I'm really hopeful. I'm gonna be careful. I'm not gonna, cowboy camp without a ground sheet under it or something like that. I'm gonna try to keep debris out of my tent so there's nothing that could be poking it. And I'm just really hopeful that this pad ends up being more durable than I've perhaps heard that it is, because I just get such a better night's sleep than when I'm using the Xlite because of the comfort of the pad. So I just really hope that it works out. If you've used either of these sleeping pads, I'd love to know your thoughts down in the comments. Do you like the pads? Do you not like the pads? Have you tried them both? What do you think? And if you're not using these sleeping pads, let me know down in the comments which sleeping pad you're using and why you think that could be the best sleeping pad for backpacking. Thank you so much for watching, you guys. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel, and I'll talk to you all next time.